When one enters the religious life and one feels one knows Christ, a new dimension opens to one. St. Paul says that when we know Christ, a new life begins for us. Old things disappear and a new way opens. This particular conversion experience may have been known by you when you were young. It is quite common. One becomes zealous in the faith. One becomes more particular about one's own private life on a moral level. One often becomes extremely censorious of other people. Certainly people young in the Christian faith are often very much more knowledgeable about things than those of us who are older in it. Charity often goes out of the window as enthusiasm and eagerness for the truth enters us. Our prayer life is very, very vigorous. We are keen on discussing our religion with others. We could wish that only so-and-so could become Christian and the world itself could be changed. This is pleasant in a way. It is the youthful approach to spirituality. God has touched the young soul. There are two types of people in a way, the once born and the twice born. Those who are once born have always known the presence of God, and they in a way do not react in this very, very emotional, censorious sort of way, so much as the twice born, those who before did not know God and suddenly they have their experience, a conversion experience, a charismatic experience in fact, and now everything is clear, whereas once they were blind, now they can see. They are full of joy. Various gifts of the Spirit may be shown to them, and indeed life goes on very well. They also, unfortunately, sometimes become rather intolerable to other people, because the one thing lacking in this particular experience is charity, the supreme Christian gift. I often prefer the word charity to love, although love ultimately perhaps is the greater word. But charity, that idea of being able to understand other people and accept and love them for what they are, rather than condemning them and feeling that in some way you are superior or that they have got to be converted to your particular approach. But when you are sure of the truth and you know it all and God is very clear to you, you feel that others have to follow your way. How actually do we know God? This is the first interesting thing. You know God by relationship. The author of The Cloud of Unknowing says, by love may he be begotten and holden, by thought never. You can never come to God by the reason. This doesn't mean to say that belief in God is irrational. If that were the case, it would be a most dreadful thing. But you come to God by some other way, and that experience of God embellishes your reason. And indeed, this is the ultimate basis of true theology. True theology starts with the experience of God, and then the mind is cultivated, and we go back into our own tradition and into the world's understanding as well. So every part of experience is brought into this greater whole. But we know God ultimately by inner experience, in the same way that the only way you can know me or anyone else is by speaking to me and feeling what I am like. Not merely speaking to me, but feeling me in silence and experiencing me in different connotations. The person, for instance, I am as I speak to you here may be very different from the person I am when I am doing my work as a priest or a doctor. Then various unpleasant traits may be apparent which wouldn't necessarily come at all on the platform. How do I behave to others? Am I patient or impatient? Do I have any time for anybody other than myself, even if I purport to be concerned about others? We know so little about ourselves, in fact, until suffering comes to us. Then we begin to know a little bit more about ourselves. Indeed, the great value, indeed importance of suffering in our life is to bring us to greater self-knowledge. I believe even our Lord knew more and more about himself progressively through his own suffering. The Christ on the cross, though obviously the same Christ as the charismatic Christ who performed his many miracles, learnt many things in Gethsemane which he knew intellectually before, but he had to experience on the deeper level of his own horror. So therefore, we know God by personal experience. I can never tell you what God is like at all, but I know that when God is with me, I am at peace. That idea of peace is important. When I am still, the peace of God comes to me, and that peace makes me not satisfied with myself, but at peace with others as well, and I can begin to expand and flow out. I become less enclosed, more open to others, and in this way I know the presence of God is with me. Because God accepts me. The basic nature of God is always to have mercy. His nature is love. Love accepts. God accepts me for what I am, not because of my goodness or my fame or my badness or anything else, but for what I am. He takes me as a whole, and therefore I can relax with him. I can be still and know the presence of God through the many vicissitudes of life. It is in this way that I begin to become more and more aware of the divine presence. He is with me as a constant presence. He fills me with love for other people. When I know that I am accepted, inadequate as I am, I can begin to accept others. I no longer look down on others or envy others. I can accept them for what they are and begin to realize that their problems are very similar to mine, although obviously we're all unique individuals. That is the quiet way of knowing the power of God. And in this way we can come closer to other people and can be still with God and can begin to pray quite spontaneously. Remember, the basis of prayer is silence with God. That is what contemplation is about. It is a state of being still with God. When you're with someone you love very much, you don't have to talk. It's the presence of that person and the aura that emanates from that person and from you that is the basis of your relationship, and it can go on forever. Indeed, love, as the Song of Songs says, is stronger than death. It can never, ever be overcome. Even if we were to give everything on a financial level for it, we would be utterly condemned, because it is beyond all earthly price. But some people who know God do not know God fully. They are in a way convinced that they have certain special things and their relationship with him is special, and this is the problem of religion generally. In the parable of the publican and the Pharisee, the Pharisee is so convinced that he knows God in a perfect way that he can look down on others. He feels he has a special relationship with God and therefore is a special person and can regard others in a different light entirely. And I'm afraid many Christians, as well as many of other religious stock as well, have this somewhat Pharisaic attitude. It comes out in a tendency to feel that we are better than others, that our way is really the right way, and that we can afford to look down on others and only wish they could be converted to our particular approach. And there is no one particular approach. There is only one approach, and that is the approach of God, not our approach at all. So, God, in his infinite kindness, as we grow in the spiritual life and are eager about our duties, are keen on our prayer and our church life and talking about our faith, begins to produce a certain torpor in the inner being. Whereas once prayer was the most wonderful thing in the world and we looked forward to it, and we could meditate on the Bible and could converse to God and speak to him in charismatic praise and prayer, now it begins to become more and more remote from us. We begin to find that this way is beginning to pall. Our faith seems to be departing, and yet it isn't departing. The way we know that our faith isn't departing is because a return to the life that we knew before God came to us would be impossible. In other words, while I could never go back to what I was before I became a Christian, and using that word in the full sense of commitment to Christ, my faith is with me. But the rather superficial, childlike approach to union with God is now no longer adequate. I find that the religious sayings of the many people are more like cliches than anything else. They do not speak to my condition at all. I find that articulated prayer becomes more and more meaningless. I find that church services themselves and liturgy itself becomes less valuable to me. I go more out of duty than out of love. And then I begin to wonder, have I lost my way at all? St. John of the Cross, of course, spoke about this as the active night of the senses going into the passive night of the senses, when the senses are no longer adequately filled with good things, and one wants only to be alone in quiet. One is moving into a different relationship with God. The relationship with God that many people have is a relationship of personal advantage. The relationship with God, ultimately, that we have to have is for God alone. In the story of Job, Job was a very, very religious man, a man of absolute piety and honesty, but he was worried the whole time that something might happen to offend his relationship with God. Therefore he sacrificed, particularly after his children had their parties. But God tempted him, God brought him to the dark night of the soul through the intermediation of the devil, and then everything that Job relied on was snatched away from him. Indeed, the story of Job is a very good account of the dark night of the soul, with the three comforters being three inadequate spiritual directors of conventional religious type who haven't got a clue about true spirituality at all, though what they say is right in its own way, and yet it has no relevance at all to the truly spiritual life. Everything has been taken away from him, and eventually, when everyone is brought to silence, God shows himself to Job, and Job is satisfied. Whereas once he knew him only by report, now he knows him by experience. This is what this whole process is about. But in the early stages, there isn't that tremendous dereliction that Job had. Job goes through what is called the passive night of the spirit as well as the passive night of the senses. But what I'm speaking about now is the passive night of the senses, when articulated prayer and the various mechanisms of religion and liturgy themselves cease to have any effect on the soul at all. At this time the person fears that his faith has gone, that his conversion has been an illusion. But the spiritual director always has to find out whether the person still wants to pray or not. The person still does want to pray, but now he wants to pray in silence. He no longer wants the distraction of liturgy or articulated prayer, verbal prayer, mental prayer, or anything of that nature. He doesn't want any of the outer trappings of religion, in other words. Now don't feel from this that I'm saying that the outer trappings of religion are bad. As a priest myself, I would be cutting my own throat if I were to make such a statement. But it all depends how that worship is carried out. It can be extremely meaningful, or it can be a load of words, as it were, and this is the tragedy of all the great religious traditions throughout the ages. When you are worshipping with someone who really is in the presence of God, he brings God to you as well, and that church knows of the presence of the divine being. But many of us use words and superficial emotional expletives, as it were, as a substitute for the true knowledge of God. But God is coming to us and telling us that this superficial way in which we are looking for favors is no longer adequate. Our religion, our work is not related to favors at all. Our work is related to service for God. One of the most interesting parables of Jesus is, of course, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. You may remember those who come at the very last moment get exactly the same wages as those who have been laboring from the beginning of the day. But that's right. When you're doing divine work, you're not interested in money at all. You do it for the work that you're doing. The money is irrelevant in any case. It is the joy of doing the work, of entering into a new dimension. But people often do not see this in the religious life at all. They are looking for something. This is one of the reasons why esotericism usually goes wrong, because here people are trying to develop some things in themselves, developing their psychic powers, or developing their power of meditation or something of that nature. In itself, this isn't necessarily evil any more than it would be wrong for me to be developing my intellect or my muscular power. But the question is, why am I doing it? If I'm doing it in order to be a more serviceable creature, that could be all right. But one doesn't develop one's psychic or meditational powers to be a better servant. One does it for personal, selfish reasons. In other words, the ego which is our basic manifestation in the world and is most important for us while we are here to be used properly. But once it becomes the master, once it becomes the dictator, then it destroys everything else. The ego consciousness is illusory ultimately, but while we are here it is an important way of functioning in this world, just as our physical body in the same way is equally important. But while we are in what would be called the active night of the senses, we are in charge and we are getting kicks out of it. And we are only sorry that other people are not as wise and brilliant as we are. And then comes the darkness, just as the darkness of night follows the light of day, and all the assurance is gone. And then we know an inner silence in which all material understanding, all intellectual props are taken away, and we are left in darkness, but we still grope for God. And if we continue, God shows us how to contemplate. Contemplation is a state in which you can be still permanently in the divine presence. Contemplation isn't merely a technique in which you use a mantra and become still and have the mind empty. These sorts of things are interesting. They can be useful props in our early development of prayer life, but this is not what spirituality is about. Spirituality is being still before God, as I even now am still before him, though I am still before you, a big audience as well. If I wasn't still before you, I would be making a sight of myself in order to impress you in some way. But if God is there, he takes it all over, and the power of God comes through me to you. That is the point. In that state you can be still and know him, and then the psychic powers are developed as well. This is the proper way of psychic development. When you are still and open to God and have left yourself behind, you enter into other dimensions of reality as well, and information can be given to you. John of the Cross himself has a very negative view of psychic experiences of all types. Those of you who have read his work at all will know this. Sometimes these manifestations may be demonic, he would say. Sometimes they may be divine. The best thing to do is to turn your back on all of them and simply be concerned about the inner state of peace that comes to you. In other words, it is your union with God that matters, not the psychic experiences at all. Many people of the Buddhist tradition would agree with this as well, and there's a lot of truth in it. On the other hand, there have been other great Christian mystics who have used the information, the locutions, and the visions that have been given in this way for important teaching. Our supreme English mystic, Julian of Norwich, is the classical example, and her revelations of divine love are possibly the most important of all mystical teachings that have come to us. They are so topical and permanent. That is why one mustn't be dogmatic about it. If I were fully for St. John of the Cross, I would say that all these visions and auditions and locutions are bad, and indeed our fellowship should forget about it all and go into the inner silence. I could say that with half of me, but the other half would know that this was cruel and inadequate. There is in fact a place to learn from what God tells us, and in fact we have to learn discrimination in the state of what then is called the active night of the spirit, which is when we have come fully into contemplation and are no longer requiring the simple pleasures of the early religious life that I was speaking about before. Then we can take what God gives us and listen and learn. But we must remember that as we enter this phase of psychic openness, not only good but also evil comes to us. And if you think that anybody is beyond the power of evil, you are mistaking reality. The further you grow in the spiritual life, the more vulnerable you are to the devil, however you understand the devil. And this is a most important point. The proof of this lies in the life of Christ himself. When he was baptized by John and the Spirit descended on him, he went into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. We remember the 3 classical temptations over 40 days and 40 nights. But believe me, those temptations in one way or another continued until the time of his resurrection. Not only the crucifixion, but the descent into hell. He was tempted the whole time. His work was to get into darkness and redeem it through the power of love. That was what he came into the world about. He didn't merely come to teach us many interesting spiritual truths. He came to redeem the darkness of the world, and all people who are entering the true Christian life, the true spiritual life. I'm speaking here on a specifically Christian level, but I don't want to be exclusive. I know that there are great saints in the other traditions as well, but I think it's wiser to stick to one's brief than become so universalistic that one loses contact with what one is talking about. But the great saints of the Christian tradition have entered the darkness, not because they want to enter it, but because this is the path. You cannot avoid it. So as one enters what is called the active night of the Spirit, when one is now full of the Spirit of God and can contemplate, and a new sense of peace and security comes on one is open much more to the psychic dimension than before, and one has a very important teaching role to play on this level. In fact, this is why any type of religious work that excludes the psychic or thinks badly of it is doing great harm. The psychic dimension of our fellowship is crucially important, not in order to get hold of mediums, in order to get hold of the dead, etc. To me, this is a perversion of what the true psychic is about. The true psychic is to get into communion with reality, as it were, through the power of God, which will bring in what we call the communion of saints, the living and the dead and all others, but on a level far above anything of the selfishness that one thinks of so much in crude, un-Christian psychism. But what I'm saying is that as you enter the spiritual level, the psychic faculty becomes open. You become the channel. God is using you, but darkness comes as well, and discrimination comes. And then there comes a time in the life of some people, not all, many people leave the world in this particular phase of the active night of the Spirit, in which tremendous darkness and horror enters the psyche. This I call the Gethsemane experience. I speak about it in my book, The Pain That Heals, as psychic darkness. Some have to go through this as well, that awareness of the love of God, that God is guiding one, and that one's contemplation is complete, and one is being filled with knowledge of various types which one has to discriminate against or about in one way or another, are suddenly obfuscated by periods of intense inner suffering in which everything is removed from one. A most terrible darkness may come, and sometimes one may be afflicted physically as well as psychically. It seems as if everything has been lost. This is called the passive night of the Spirit. This is the real dark night of the soul. It isn't merely a state in which the pleasures of the past pall and one doesn't really know what to do in the future. It is an actual it's an actual assault, as it were, by the powers of darkness. John of the Cross would say that it is God's way of purifying the soul fully, so that it looks for no rewards other than the true love of God. But I think there is more to it than this, and I'm sure John of the Cross would have agreed as well here. It is an actual assault by the evil forces of the world. Is there spiritual darkness in the world? This is the interesting thing about it. In a glib, optimistic community, evil isn't given its full power or its full relevance at all. It's often described as the absence of good. But believe me, when you are involved in this realm, you begin to realize that evil has positive powers. Its end is to destroy actively. If you think of a person like Hitler, for instance, who is a peg on which one can hang many different thoughts, his aim was to destroy whole groups of people and to render society of such a horrible type that none of us could have borne it. And the same could apply to others as well. Obviously, one doesn't want to get into political ideology here. That would be quite unpardonable. But there are powers and principalities that St. Paul speaks about in high places, both in the intermediate realms and working through people in our own society and all societies that are channels or mediums for the dark forces. In other words, there are psychic mediums of a high currency who bring us to light, and there are others of a very low currency who bring us to darkness. And the darkness will always triumph over the light, because it's much easier to destroy than to build. They will always triumph over the light until we know the power of God fully. It's so much easier for me to hate you than to love you. Hatred is destructive, and if I see someone that I hate, pushed down to the ground, I can triumph over it and say, she's gone now, I'm free, which is an illusion, of course, but you can see the pleasure of destruction. This is the terrible part about it. But love takes a long time, and it requires sacrifice day after day, so that one leaves one's ego behind entirely and a new dimension of reality comes to one. And for some people, there is this terrible experience of the full power of evil in the world that comes and obfuscates every aspect of our knowledge, even our experience of God. Sometimes it comes in the form of a fear that knows no explanation at all. Sometimes it comes in the form of the heart almost being torn out of the body, so that one is enveloped in a darkness that is so painful that only suicide, in fact, seems reasonable. Sometimes it comes in the form of a terrible disillusionment, but usually it's very active and powerful, an absolute fear, a fear of suffocation, a fear of strangulation, not merely of the body, but of the whole being. Many of us, you see, feel that we don't really worry about death at all. It wouldn't worry two hoots if we were to die, because we all know we're going to die anyhow. But actually, when you are confronted with the fact of complete annihilation, it does matter. We can delude ourselves so much, particularly if we dabble superficially in psychic and spiritualistic matters and read certain superficial books on the subject. But ultimately, we have to have the experience ourselves. That is the important thing. Then you begin to realize that it is not nice to face the possibility of annihilation. You begin to realize that there are depths in your unconscious that are not plumbed ordinarily at all. Those that have had the horrible experience of concentration camps or things of that nature and have come through are the ultimately blessed ones. They begin to know something if they have assimilated and integrated these experiences in their own life. They cannot be rationalized away according to some psychodynamic theory. They are the very aspect of life itself. This is what Job knew in his terrible experience, remembering that Job, of course, is a story rather than a historical sequence. But this is what our Lord Jesus Christ knew fully. He knew it was coming on him. He warned his disciples 3 times. But when it did come on him in Gethsemane, it was still almost too terrible to bear. So you can still know it intellectually, but when it comes existentially, it can be awful. This is the moment, in fact, in which every aspect of the personality is being made clear and nothing is being hidden at all. What can you do when it happens to you? Here I speak not from what I have read, but from what I have experienced. We speak of what we know, as Jesus says to Nicodemus in that lovely sequence in John 3. You can only pray, but how can you pray when all around you is dark, when all around you is nothing? Somehow, even then, the soul still knows that God is there. This is the whole point of the matter. Just as in the earlier passive night of the senses, when all the trappings of religion fall flat, one just has this inner faith that leads one to a deeper contemplation. So now, when one is being assailed and everything is being torn away from one, the knowledge of God is still there, because if there is no God, there is nothing at all. This is the crude reason, as it were, that inspires the soul. And if you lift your consciousness to the highest level, to the very top of the head, and call on the name of God, and are still, he can enter you. It's almost a technique of light, not calling on light. But if you pray intensely, remembering that Christ himself was crucified at the place of the skull, Golgotha or Calvary as we call it, you can, in this terrible state, get divine light coming to you and you can be saved. It's a terrible experience, and I know more and more people in one way or another are having it. If you don't know what to do, sometimes it can be so terrible that you will want to take your life immediately. In other words, this isn't merely an interesting psychopathological or spiritual discourse of interest to those involved in mysticism. It is tremendously important in the lives of people. This is why the teaching of profound, rapt prayer is so important. For a time we can hide behind the trappings of everyday life, including everyday religion, whether it's evangelical biblicism or Catholic Mass and Eucharist or whatever it is, and this can be the thing that is all important to us. But there comes a time when we go beyond this to the ultimate darkness. But there is one who is always present, and that is God. We are being assailed by the dark forces, and our work ultimately in this experience is healing. I can see this now, just as Jesus, when he went through his terrible experience, was starting the redemption of all the darkness of the world. When he died, he had only put the work into practice, as it were, but 2,000 years later we are still lamentably behind what we should be doing. But only those who can experience this utter darkness that comes both from themselves and the world can begin to be the ones who may save the world. If you are a psychologically orientated person, say a Jungian psychodynamic theorist, you will feel that all these experiences are interior and you're experiencing more and more of the shadow, etc. And I'm sure that's true, but I'm also sure that that's inadequate. We are members one of another. I'm not merely an inner complex of interesting psychological elements, which I certainly am, of course, but I'm also a member of you and you of me, and we are all interwoven. There is a cosmic harmony that involves not only us, but all creation, so that no one person can be saved until everybody is saved. Salvation is universal. So when one has these experiences, it isn't only personal, it is interpersonal and transpersonal as well. This is something that the pure psychologist cannot understand. It is something that you have to learn. As you come to this knowledge, you begin to see yourself more clearly, and your own unconscious becomes more and more open. And you begin to realize that some of these intimations had come to you even in earlier life. I believe that young children know quite a lot of these things, but they are talked out of them. But as we grow into full being, we have to enter into the childhood again. As Christ would say, unless you become as a little child, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. And to me, this statement becomes more and more meaningful as my own life progresses. It isn't becoming as I was when I was a little child, but entering into that psychic experience which I knew then, with obviously the wisdom and understanding that have come to me through my adult education and the life I have led since that time. I wouldn't want to be what I was 50 years ago, but on the other hand, I can never escape what I was then, because the ultimate wisdom was with me then, and now, hopefully, at any rate, it has been made real and actualized through the life I have led, through the mistakes I have made, and also the good things that I have done. That applies to all of us in one way or another. But this is what the dark night of the soul is about. It is a time in which we are assailed by all the darkness of the world, and all that is dark in ourselves comes out as well in sympathy. And we, as it were, are out on a limb. There isn't a single friend. No human being can help us at all, except the one who has passed on the path before us. And needless to say, he is a rare entity. Usually such a person is a very humble individual. He is usually not particularly well skilled in psychology or theology or any of these things, unfortunately. But he has come through it, and he, by his very presence, can be a support. When Jesus went to Gethsemane, he took his three closest disciples, John, James, and Peter, with him. He hoped that they might support him. Of course, they were completely useless. They were men of clay, as it were. They were useless at that time. But I'm sure he brought them there, not only for their good, but for his good as well. But he said, "What, couldn't you stay awake even an hour? The flesh is willing, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Our spirit is willing, the inner being is willing, it wants God. But until the whole personality is brought Godward, it's no good. This is why the Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the body is so important. It isn't that when I die some part of me will float on, and that's that. Ultimately everything in me, every experience has got to be redeemed. Nothing is lost. Everything is part of the universal whole. It's a tremendous doctrine, of course. It can't be explained glibly, but the meaning behind it is immense. It is in this way that you begin to see what this work is about. The mystics of the past and the present shared in this experience, but I believe the mystic of today is going to find this more and more. Many mystics, of course, wouldn't have understood the dark night of the soul that St. John of the Cross spoke about at all. In Eastern Orthodoxy, it plays a minimal part, and the Orthodox tradition is of a rather different type. but I still think that the fully Catholic tradition comes closer to the real meaning of God in our lives. And as we are confronted by a power of evil that was infinitely greater now than ever before, so we on the spiritual path have to begin to accept this as well. There is no escape from it, but we can grow through it. And I long for the time when we have a group of people, hopefully our own fellowship, in which there might be the spiritual knowledge to help people on the path. If I, in my experiences, had gone to my medical colleagues or psychiatrists, I would undoubtedly have been given drugs, and I would have undoubtedly been told that there were problems in my life before, which I knew very well about in any case. There is no life that doesn't have inner problems in any case. But of course an inner knowledge told me to eschew this entirely. This would have been the most stupid thing in the world. Not because these people are bad, it isn't that at all, it's a question of lack of knowledge. The one-eyed man doesn't go to the blind man for guidance. Hopefully he goes for the fully sighted, if you can find such a person. And indeed, in this experience, you are being given new sight yourself if you have the courage to persist. This is the important thing. And if you do persist, you can be the way-shower to others. Everything that is hidden is brought to light. Nothing ultimately remains hidden, as it were. But in this dark night of the soul, the whole cosmic evil of the world is laid bare, and it assaults the individual. If you are not a person of prayer and humility, you can be crushed by it. This is why an earnest prayer life and a life of service for others, and above all a life in which you do not seek anything for yourself on a spiritual level, but as one of giving to others, is alone the way in which one can come through this into the full knowledge of God. We remember that God is the creator of all things. Even evil in the end is under the divine control. If it wasn't, there'd be no hope for any of us at all. That is why in our creed we say we believe in one God, Father, the creator of all things visible and invisible, but there is nothing that is not ultimately under his creative control. I would not say that God created evil, but he certainly created the possibility of evil by giving his sentient creatures free will. This is the mystery, of course, of evil. But if there is no evil, there is no growth. If there is no suffering, there is no understanding. We remain as we were in the active night of the senses, fully assured of ourselves and our brilliance and how far better we are than others, the typical Pharisee who looks down on the publican and thanks God that he is so much better than other people. But as we grow in the darkness, so we can really begin to help other people and understand what God is telling us about reality. This is an integral part of the mystical experience. Until we can face every part of our own being and the cosmic darkness of the world, we will never know God fully, and we will never really be able to help other people. Is there anybody who has this full knowledge? Obviously only one, Jesus Christ. Others who have gone on the way are beginning to glimpse certain things. But if you can bear this, this is perhaps the most important part of the spiritual life that we have on earth, because then you depend on nothing at all except the eternal presence of God in your life.